Hi, I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. The historic nuclear agreement with Iran has now been implemented, and 5 American prisoners who were being held in Iran have returned to the U.S. President Obama praised the power of diplomacy and the new opportunities it'll create, while his critics have called it capitulation and weakness in dealing with a determined foe. For a closer look at the debate and a new poll on Syria and Iran, I want to welcome Barbara Slavin. Barbara's Washington correspondent for Al Monitor and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she's the acting director of the Future of Iran Initiative. She's also author of the book Bitter Friends and Bosom Enemies, Iran and the United States, The Twisted Path to Confrontation. Thanks for joining us, Barbara.
Sure, my pleasure.
I want to start, if we could, with the release of the prisoners, and also at the same time with the capture of the 10 American naval personnel who were caught in Iranian waters. Both events combined seem to me to sort of, they provoked responses, unique responses in different quarters, but also seemed to sort of capture in the moment the different levels of the conflict and the situation where we are right now. In the U.S., let's look at that one first. You had the president calling it the release of the 5 prisoners a victory for diplomacy. And he also said, well, John Kerry said, he had an interesting quote about it. He captured it, I think, quite well. He said, we have proven once again that diplomacy is always our first choice and war is our last resort. And the president, in a statement directly to the Iranian people, said that we have a rare chance to pursue a new path, a different, better future that delivers progress both for our peoples and the wider world. We need to take advantage of it. This view was echoed in Iran by Rouhani, who himself had some very positive words echoing the president's message. He said, today is the beginning of a new era, a new chapter with the region and the world. Now, while that was going on, let's listen to what Ted Cruz had to say at the Republican debate. We have a quote from Ted Cruz. Actually, this is after the debate.
Any nation that captures our military officers, captures our soldiers, should face serious repercussions. And the reason Iran felt free to do that, to seize those ships and to humiliate those sailors.
In this particular case, what would you have done? I mean, I'm not saying it was right, but they were released in 14 hours. You still would have taken action?
They were released in 14 hours, but the only reason they were seized is because of the weakness of Barack Obama. The Obama-Clinton foreign policy leading from behind. Our enemies are laughing at us.
Okay, the final quote I want to put up is from Adel Jaber, the Saudi foreign minister, who was asked about the implementation of the agreement, and here's what he had to say.
Are you okay with the billions of dollars that Iran is about to get as a result of the nuclear deal?
Wolf, I think most countries in the world are not okay with it. I think most countries in the world are concerned that Iran will use these funds in order to fund its nefarious activities rather than use them to develop its country and improve the living standards of its people. I hope I'm wrong.
Let's pull all of this apart. That's what I'd like to do right now. First of all, on the administration side, diplomacy works. We see that. But is there a strategy here? Do you see the outlines of a broader American strategy, not only with Iran, but for the region itself?
Well, I'm not sure about the whole region, frankly. There, I think we're just desperately trying to keep a lid on it, which is obviously complex. With Iran, there has been a strategy, and we've seen it since the beginning of the Obama administration. You remember, he came to office saying he was going to reach out his hand to adversarial regimes. We've seen it with Cuba, we've seen it with Myanmar, we've seen it with Iran. And he's been very consistent. I think he's also been consistent in saying that the priority was the nuclear issue, that whatever else we may think of Iran, it's important to keep this country from getting a nuclear weapon. That's priority number 1. If anything else good flows from it, that's icing on the cake. But that wasn't the original reason for approaching Iran. So I think it's very interesting to look at the criticisms that we're hearing now. There were people who said there would never be a nuclear deal. Iran would never agree to limitations on its program. Then they said, well, okay, we got the deal, but our hostages were still there. And Iran is still behaving badly in the region. I mean, there will always be some reason for people to be unhappy with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Here's the difference, though, between Cuba, in particular, and Iran. In the case of Cuba, an opening to Cuba also creates positive repercussions in the Southern Hemisphere because so many Latin American countries saw it as an obstacle to our normalization, not only with Cuba, but also with them. And Iran, as you see from the Adel Jaber quote, has a regional footprint that has created dissonance across the water and also in other situations. When I ask about a strategy, it's not just the opening to Iran, but an opening to Iran that doesn't create provocation on the other side, because the Saudis are feeling quite nervous right now and are reacting to that nervousness in ways that may exacerbate conflicts.
If there had been no nuclear deal, the Saudis would have been unhappy too, because, in fact, more unhappy because the Iranians would have been marching smartly toward a nuclear weapons capability, which would have forced them to start to create their own. I think that the Saudis are not, you can't please them. No matter what we did, we could not please them. They would have been unhappy without a deal. Now they're unhappy with a deal because they're afraid it signals that the United States is looking toward Iran and thinking about Iran and taking Iran's views into account as we approach regional problems. And the Saudis want the United States only to be on their side. I suppose it's natural. But, how much affinity do we have now with Saudi Arabia? Do we support Saudi policies? I had to laugh, Adel Jaber, talking about Iran's nefarious activities when Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen back into the Stone Age. I mean, you need a little perspective.
Well, about Yemen, there was this provocative statement by an Iranian official that we're now in 4 capitals. And that did create nervousness on Saudi Arabia. So not just with the Saudis, but also with other Arab countries who we're seeing Iran overreach in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen now.
Saudis have also talked about cutting off the head of the snake. That was King Abdullah a long time ago. No, there's no love lost between them. But if you look at the Yemen situation, that was Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president of Yemen, and the Houthis, who primarily made this decision on their own. Did they have some Iranian encouragement and help? It's entirely possible. Now, look, the relationship is, I think this is very apt when you talk about Cuba, and that Cuba is embraced by its region in a way that Iran is not. But there are some countries that are happy to see Iran come back in from the cold. Perhaps some countries in Central Asia and South Asia. Europe is happy. It will be able to trade with Iran again.
But then there's also Bashar al-Assad and there's Hezbollah. I mean, there is a regional problem here.
Absolutely. And the question is,
can they be reconciled?
Can they be reconciled?
Can the U.S. play a leadership role as part of a broader regional strategy to bring these 2 countries together to help unwind some of these conflicts that are plaguing them now?
We've already seen the U.S. insist now that Iran be at the table in Syria negotiations, which was a welcome step, toward realism. I mean, whatever you may think about Iran, without Iran present, you're not going to solve these problems. So I think, we're in an interesting moment. I don't think we can look forward with any great optimism about the short term. But over the medium and long term, I think this is a very important breakthrough. And I disagree with a lot of Iran analysts in this town who say, oh, it's transactional, it's not transformational. I think it is transformational, both for the region and for Iran internally. Again, it's going to take time for these trends to play out. But I think this was a very crucial step.
We're going to look at the internal Iran in just a minute. But I want to get back to the different layers of reaction. There's not just the Republican reaction, but Hillary Clinton has not been a big fan. She supported the agreement, but has taken a cautious and even critical stance on this. You have written about the need for the president to institutionalize
Yes.
this agreement and this new opening. What are the prospects that might occur? And if they don't occur, what are the prospects of this agreement surviving the Obama administration? Because clearly the Republicans will do what they can to bring it to an end. And as I said, Secretary Clinton has not been a big supporter.
Yeah, well, she hasn't. In the most recent debate, actually, she was less hawkish, and she kind of wrapped herself in the nuclear deal and in Obama's achievement. It was
Wrapped
interesting.
herself in Obama is what she did.
She did, and she did that when it came to the Iran nuclear
Yeah.
deal as well. I was kind of pleased to see that that may be more of the influence of Bernie Sanders than anything else. No, I think the deal will go on. It is in the advantage of Iran to abide by it, certainly, and it's in the advantage of the next administration to abide by it, as long as Iran, keeps its word and does not try to break the deal. This pushes out, for at least a decade, any possibility of an Iranian bomb. And that's really in everyone's interest. I mean, it seems quite obvious. So I think it will go on despite the rhetoric of Ted Cruz and some of the others. The question of whether the U.S. can institutionalize the relationship depends on the Iranians as much as it does on the U.S. I have written that before Obama leaves office, perhaps after our presidential elections, he could offer to send some Americans back to Iran to staff an interest section. That's shy of full normalization. And that would facilitate Iranians getting visas to come to the United States. It would mean that if other Americans are arrested in Iran, we would actually have diplomats on the ground who could deal with it instead of having to work through the Swiss and secret back channels and so on.
And I know it
So
would be
it's
appreciated
possible.
by Iranian Americans who want to travel
Very
and
much
are
so.
blocked from doing so. Let's look at some other numbers, because we're going to shift now to the third level, and that's this broader Arab concern about Iran's role in the region. And these are some poll numbers that you and I have worked on, where you did some analysis at an event. The first set deal with the Syria conflict and the cause of the conflict in Syria being Iranian-backed groups. When asked in all of these different countries, Arab and Turkey, Iranian-backed groups get extraordinarily high numbers, except in Lebanon, which has a very different relationship with Iran. And now the second set of numbers, again on Syria, Bashar al-Assad, which is Syria's, Iran's #1 ally. Again, you get significant numbers everywhere but in Iran, which has been backing him. And it's this that I raise questions about, because there are those who say the Iran deal is a good deal on the nuclear issue, but the question of the regional involvement is something that is of concern. And the Arab concern, of course, is that the Iranians are going to now be able to embolden themselves in broader ways.
Yeah.
Just respond to that, if you will.
Sure. I mean, look, even before they got sanctions relief, they were supporting Assad and supporting Hezbollah and supporting and creating Shia militias, pan-Shia militias that have been fighting in Syria with Iraqi Shia and Afghan Shia and even Pakistani Shia, according to some reports. So the notion that they're suddenly going to double down on Assad, I mean, they're already doing it. To my mind, at least we have an Iran that isn't going to be a nuclear weapons power, and that is better for the whole region. Syria is a very complicated issue. There were some second thoughts about supporting Assad a few years ago in Iran, which I certainly noticed the last time that I was there. But that has changed, and it's changed because of the advent of Daesh. And now most Iranians think, well, we have to support Assad because he's better than Daesh, and if he goes, that who is going to control
And here's the conundrum.
Syria.
Here's the conundrum. One might agree that the Assad regime is a powerful check on the ground, but it also is
Creates
a
it.
factor that helps promote that group, not directly promoting it, but creating the discontent among many who say this is a reasonable response. Just as in Iraq, it was the Maliki regime and its behavior that caused Sunnis to
Yeah, I totally
move
agree.
in that direction. So the need for adult supervision or
Yeah.
America to play a different role is, I guess, what people are asking about. Is there a regional strategy that America has once having done the one thing to then find a way to
Yeah.
pivot to solving some of these broader regional conflicts?
I think there's a strategy. I don't know if it'll work. There's a UN process which envisions Assad stepping down at some point. There are efforts to organize an opposition to Assad that is, that you can, that's respectable and that's coherent. That's a little bit more difficult because we have differences among the various patrons of the different groups. I mean, the Saudis want a certain group, the Russians want another group, the Turks don't want the Kurds to be represented. So I think, that's where the problem lays. The urgent need is for a ceasefire so that the death toll comes down, the barrel bombing stops, and the refugee flows stop. And I think that's what the focus is right now. What happened in Lebanon. There were many ceasefires over the course of a 15-year civil war, and sometimes the country was more hellish than at other times.
And what only solved Lebanon was Syria.
Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iran, right?
The question I wonder about is who's going to play Syria in Syria? I mean, who can help stabilize the situation?
Well,
There is
look,
no
ultimately, it would be the Saudis, the Turks,
Right, and
the
the
United
Iranians.
States, the Russians, and the Iranians.
yeah.
They're the ones who will, when Syria is sufficiently exhausted, will say, okay, this is the
and
deal.
we're not there yet.
No, I'm
We're
afraid
there
we're
yet.
not.
I want to now switch to internal Iran and look at some of the numbers which touch on some of these various questions. With regard to the nuclear agreement itself, how do Iranians view it? This is in the broader region. Do they support it? Do they support it? And the answer is that they largely don't, except in Lebanon, some
Jordan's not too
ambivalence
bad.
in Jordan, and ambivalence in Turkey. I mean, in the 50-50 range. Now let's go to the next one. Are they confident that it'll work? And much less confidence. And now let's look inside Iran about the agreement. There's support for the agreement, and this is also quite interesting in terms of its ambivalence. They support the agreement, but they think it's a bad idea to have given up their nuclear weapons program. And they weren't supportive of that. Let's go to the next one.
Yeah, I love
Here's
this
what
one.
they want. This is the interesting thing, I think, about what the Iranians want now that there's an agreement. They want investment in the economy. They want to advance democracy and protect rights. And way down the line is less than 50% is giving greater support for their allies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. How, with oil prices being what they are, and with the flow of money not being, as critics say, in the hundreds of billions, but it's actually freeing assets that may produce 100 or so billion, and oil revenues.
It's 32 billion, according to the Iranians. That's what they say they're going to get back.
So it's not as much as the critics have said. The point is, can all this be done? I mean, can the Iranian people get what they're looking for now that expectations have been raised by this agreement? Or is there something that's going to now be is there going to be a difficult internal political situation as they don't get political rights, as they don't get an improved economy?
Yeah, there are a number of power struggles that are going on as we speak. And certainly the economic benefits are not going to be immediate. President Rouhani had a press conference after implementation day where he kind of compared the situation to a garden. He said, suppose somebody had taken your garden away and then suddenly they give it back to you. He said, you have to work on the soil, you have to plant the seeds. You're not going to have fruit overnight. So he was asking for patience. I think it was important for him to get implementation day as quickly as they did because there are parliamentary elections coming up in February, at the end of February in Iran. But he's asking for more time to show the fruits. And in terms of domestic political rights, well, that's an old struggle that's been going on between the reform movement and the hardliners. And it's in the long term, I remain optimistic, but in the short term, it's going to be a little tough.
The Ayatollah has given the nod to the president, but has also been warning about the moving too far and having expectations too great. Care should be taken that the other side fulfills its commitments completely, warning about the fact that the Americans may not be quite honest in their handling of this. but also on the internal side, which is the one that concerns me. Oil prices now being a third of what they were when sanctions were first imposed, and the Iranians aren't going to get this big influx of cash, but expectations are high. Could this in either, where do you think, as an Iran expert, who's going to benefit from this in terms of the internal debate, the reformers or the hardliners?
Well, I'll know better after I go to Iran. I'm hoping to go there for the elections and get a better sense. I mean, my experience in Iran is people are very cynical about the government, frankly. And there were no celebrations on the streets on implementation day. We saw some celebrations when the agreement was reached back in the summer, and when the statement of principles, the framework for the agreement was reached back in April. But nobody came out and celebrated, because they know it's going to take time for them to see any benefits from this.
One last thing, and that's Syria. I want to go back to Syria for a minute. You interviewed Chuck Hagel on this.
Well, I asked him a question at an event.
The Assad obsession, and he had an interesting comment. Let's just put that up for a second.
Sure.
Something else, we have allowed ourselves to get caught and paralyzed on our Syrian policy by the statement that Assad must go. Assad was never our enemy. A brutal dictator, yes, a lot of brutal dictators out there. I'm not for brutal dictators. But we should have learned from Hussein, Saddam Hussein, and Gaddafi. You can take a brutal dictator out, but better understand what you may get in return. We never ask that question, what's coming after Assad? Comment.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Chuck Hagel's. I think he's a very level-headed guy. Obama made two very big mistakes on Syria, in my view. He should never have said Assad must go unless he was sure that this was going to happen or he was going to bring it about. It made him look ridiculous. It has made our president look ridiculous. The other thing was he never should have set a red line for the chemical weapons, because even though we did manage to get most of the chemical weapons out, the U.S., there was an expectation the U.S. was going to take military action. It did not take military action. So these were rookie mistakes, frankly, by President Obama, and he should have known better. You don't, as Chuck Hagel also said during that appearance at the Atlantic Council, he said, when the President of the United States makes comments, makes statements, they mean something. They should mean something. So I fault Obama for that. I think he could have done more to protect the Syrian people early on with a no-fly zone. But on the other hand, I agree with Chuck Hagel that to get rid of Assad now without knowing what's going to take his place would be highly irresponsible.
And the administration was loath to do the no-fly zone because it would have required a commitment of many more forces than they were willing to do. It's not just flying planes overhead. It required troops on the ground, and they weren't willing to do that. And the situation hasn't changed at all in terms of the resistance on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. Even the toughest talking Republicans don't want to send troops into the situation. And so what we're left with is this Vienna or Geneva or whatever process, and that doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Not immediately, and that's certainly because of the Saudi-Iranian rift, which has gotten much worse after the Saudis executed a Shia sheikh, and then Iranian bully boys went and trashed the Saudi embassy in Tehran. So I think it's going to take a little while for people to cool down, and then I hope they will get back to this process. But right now, Assad isn't going anywhere, the Russians aren't going anywhere, the Iranians aren't going anywhere, and the U.S. focus has been on trying to reduce the amount of territory that ISIS, Daesh, controls in Syria and Iraq.
With limited success, in the sense that there are no boots on the ground.
With some success.
Other than the Kurds, there's the Kurdish forces in the north and the east, but what are called the allies of America are a really mixed lot at best.
They are indeed. But yeah, some advances have been rolled back in both Iraq and Syria.
More so in Iraq.
And certainly Daesh is not expanding its control of territory. What it's doing is inspiring or fomenting terrorist attacks all around the world.
Which appears to be a new strategy.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. They're playing the Al-Qaeda game.
Yeah, they've decided to be Al-Qaeda.
Now, you mentioned the difficulty of determining which opposition participate. There is the Iran-Saudi conflict. There is the Russian-American agreement. How deep is that agreement, and how committed are both, or are they simply maneuvering because there's no other game to play?
I think the latter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so your expectation is we'll see this for
A while.
a while.
Yeah.
Then back to Iran. Next step, you think, will be there's a release of funds.
Yeah, they've gotten, or will have gotten, $32 billion very shortly.
And Congress is going to be debating a whole series of, as they, I think they've done 61 efforts to roll back the Affordable Care Act. They'll probably get a bunch of them in on this. Any impact at all, or?
No, zero, as long as there's a Democrat in the White House, zero. And even after, as I mentioned, this is now international law. It's been codified by a UN Security Council resolution. The United States can move unilaterally to put new sanctions on, but without particularly our European allies joining us, it doesn't have much meaning.
You're going to the election? I want to talk to you
Inshallah.
after you come back.
If I get a visa. So whoever is out there and is watching, and in the Irshad, as they call it, please give me a visa.
Thanks for joining us. These will be actually quite momentous elections in terms of the direction the Iranian people choose to take.
I'm not so sure, but it'll be interesting to be there during that period. It's always interesting.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
That's all the time we've got right now. For more information, you can follow us at AAI USA on Twitter, or check out our website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.